Good morning, everybody. So today I am wrapping up my introduction to the four major areas of Sanshin's practice vision, and I see some folks have the practice vision in front of you for reference. So we've now covered Zazen and Sanshin, we've covered Dharma study and Dogen themes, we've covered work and Myoho Bodhisattva leadership, and today we're considering ritual. So ritual sometimes makes North American practitioners uncomfortable, right? Maybe it feels a bit like it's a magic world superstition kind of undertaking, or like arbitrary movements or choreography that we're expected to do based on who knows what. Why do we hold our hands this way? Why do we move like this? So in any case, I think we can feel disconnected sometimes from ritual, maybe when we first arrive, or maybe after we've been doing it for a while. Like, what are we doing? So particularly in the midst of a practice tradition that made its way here from a different part of the world and arose in a different kind of a culture, in another time, in another place, it can feel like these things don't feel connected to me. They don't feel relevant to me. They didn't arise from my own experience. So folks can spend their whole lives, of course, studying the meaning of ritual. Certainly in the academic world, there are many, many people who spend their entire careers studying the meaning of ritual. Buddha knows we can approach this thing from the standpoint of sociology, anthropology, religious studies, philosophy, history, other areas, psychology, right? There are many, many gateways into thinking about or understanding or investigating the human experience that is ritual and the human experience that leads to the arising of ritual. So if you want to dive into this thing, the research is there. There's no question. There's plenty to read and take in. So what I want to discuss today is what this thing means within Sanshin's style. What does this mean for the practice that we do here on a day-to-day basis? So how does this fit into the practice vision? This is a real challenge for us because we can't look to our immediate ancestors for help with this area the way we can with something like Zazen or Dharma study. Uchiyama Roshi didn't do a lot of ritual at Antaiji, not because he didn't think it was important, but because he had a different kind of a mission. He was doing something else. Therefore, Toda-san will say he didn't also do a lot of ritual with his teacher. That doesn't mean, by the way, that he doesn't understand ritual, right? He did his training at Zuioji and other places in order to qualify as clergy. So it's not like we don't have that in our communal awareness, right? In our communal understanding. But I think we're still working out what ritual means for us here as North Americans who inherited this practice from Uchiyama Roshi, from Toda-san, from the ancestors that came before them. I think we actually have, it's kind of an exciting time. I think we're still sort of coming to grips with this. What does this mean for us? And what does it mean for us going forward as a largely not Japanese Sangha? So here at Sanshin, when we talked about work practice, we talked about that being an active engagement with the community in this time and place. When we're doing work practice, yeah, there's an individual task, really, but the larger context of that is an investigation of community or an active engagement with community right here and now, right? Ritual is an active engagement with the community across space and time. At least that's my thinking about it, right? So we're still engaged with a community, but we're engaged with a community across space and time, which is really interesting when you put those two things together, work and ritual. One of the questions I had to ask myself is, how are these things different? Because we're doing all of this with body and mind. So like, how is ritual different from work practice? There's a little bit of a gray area. So ritual has a lot of names. At least in North America. We frequently conflate it with things like form, rite, liturgy, service, ceremony, right? I'm using ritual in the practice vision because it seems like the most generic term, the most inclusive kind of name we can give this without a lot of charge. So under that umbrella, I'm including things like forms like gasho, right? Ceremonies like the morning service we do 5 times a week, the way we take meals using oryoki, the way we put on robes and rakusu, all that stuff under this umbrella that I'm calling ritual. So even though those things have some different individual aspects, different individual elements, for the purpose of our investigation of that, that's one big tent to me. So when we look around at the way ritual is explained in North American Soto Zen, we encounter a few key messages, I think, over and over and over. I went around and said, what are my peers saying about ritual? How are we explaining this to our sanghas? So several things sort of come up all the time. There's about, I don't know, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 of these things. Rituals are about experiencing non-separation. Rituals are about cultivating self-discipline. Rituals are about making the invisible visible. Rituals are about bringing people together for a shared public experience. Rituals are about being mindful. Rituals are about repeating actions over and over until your mind is freed from discriminative thinking, and then Zazen mind naturally takes over. And rituals are about cultivating and expressing gratitude. So those things aren't wrong. I don't think they tell the full story. None of those is not correct, but I think there's a larger picture happening here. So I think there's a lot more going on here than sort of ritual as self-improvement or ritual as an exercise in community building. That's an element, but I think there's something else happening. So like Zazen, ritual is the complete expression of awakening. In that way, it's not different from Zazen. And we can say the same thing about work, practice, and study also, right? Ritual is the complete expression of awakening. So this is awakening. So awakening that's not expressed in our practice is just our idea about awakening. So we can sit at home and think about, what's awakening about? And then we can get up with our bodies and minds and do some kind of ritual. It's like, oh, that is a complete expression of awakening. There is no other awakening than what we express in practice, right? It's not anywhere else than that. So ritual lends form and structure to that expression. We're expressing Buddha nature, we're expressing the Dharma, we're expressing awakening all the time, and ritual lends a particular kind of structure and form to that expression. It also gives us the opportunity to inquire pretty deeply into what are we actually doing with this body and mind. When we're bowing, what are we doing with this body and mind? When we're chanting, when we're doing gasho, what are we really doing with this body and mind? So I'm describing this as rituals form us as we give it form. So ritual forms us as we give that ritual form. There's some mutuality happening there. Of course, we can really say that that's true about any of the elements in the practice vision, Zazen, work, study, as well as ritual, right? These things are all giving form to this expression. They're forming us while we are doing them, while we are forming them. So you might be surprised that ritual is one of the 4 elements in our practice vision, and in fact, I had not included it there until Todo-san pointed out, we haven't accounted for that part of our practice, right? We need to include that somehow. Those are activities that just don't fit entirely neatly into the other 3 practice elements. They are certainly not unrelated. Zazen, work, and study are certainly not unrelated to ritual, but the whole ritual piece just doesn't fit under one of those umbrellas. We have to kind of call it out and give it its own spot. So you might be surprised that it's included there because the second of our 6 points of practice is keeping form simple so we understand what we're doing and why. So why would we devote an entire quarter of our practice vision space to something that we're actually saying, we keep that pretty simple. We don't go deeply into that. We don't do nearly the elaborate stuff that some other Dharma centers do, and certainly the temples might do in Japan. Some folks conclude on that basis, well, that's because Sanshin doesn't like that stuff. Or we don't think it's important, or we don't think it's meaningful, or we just plain don't know how to do it. None of those perceptions is accurate. It's not that we don't care about it. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's not that we don't find it meaningful. We keep it simple for a very particular practice reason, right? So we don't do rituals just because they're on the liturgical calendar. If you've ever looked at the Gyoji Kihan, the ceremony manual from Sotoshu, it is largely driven by the liturgical calendar. There is something to do on a daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, annual basis. It drove a lot of our life in the Senmon Soto. Oh, it's the 5th day. It's time for the Bodhidharma Memorial. It's like there would be a list, and we would go through the list. Oh, it's the such and so day. It's time for this. The week, by the way, in the Senmon Soto was a 5-day week, not a 7-day week, which added a layer of confusion for those of us that are used to a 7-day week. There were things that happened every 5. So we were largely driven by sort of a list that existed. And we just said, what are we doing today? And there was the list, right? So we don't do rituals simply because they're on a list. We also don't do them in order to carry out some kind of beautiful exotic performance. As much as we might find our ceremonies, our rituals, our liturgy to be beautiful and meaningful, we're not doing them in order to do a performance. And there's a fine line there. So we're not doing them to worship or appease or petition something disconnected from ourselves. So we're certainly invoking Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and we are setting up some aspiration that something good will happen, but it's not a question of worship or appeasement or something like that. So all of that's true, and also we're not afraid to do as complex and traditional a ceremony or a form or a ritual as the situation seems to warrant. So if you've ever been here for some of the more complicated things we do, like Hosenshiki, all the elements are there. We do whatever that is as thoroughly and as sincerely as possible. We do everything we possibly can to make that a complete expression of awakening. So the rituals and the ceremonies that we do here arise directly from the life of the Sangha and from the needs of the practitioners. So when Todo-san established this place, he kind of looked around and said, what do these folks need to be doing? On that basis, for instance, we do Rakufusatsu because he thought it was important that we had regular exposure to precepts. Right? So the things we're doing here are not, we're going to get out the calendar, get out the Gyoji-Kihan, oh, it's the 5th day, we're going to do something. So often, when we identify a need in the Sangha, there is an established form within the Soto Zen tradition for meeting those needs, but if there isn't one, we're not afraid to make something up. There used to be a big lilac bush in front of this building, and when it died and we had to take it out, there was some general feeling we ought to be doing some kind of service, some kind of memorial service for the lilac bush, which we did. We dug into the tradition and said, what feels meaningful about this? I have photos I can show you of Todo-san bowing to the lilac bush. Right? It was something that arose out of the life of this Sangha. Here was something we had passed every day for, the entire existence of Sanshin, going in and out of the building, and we thought, well, that needs some kind of bookmark, bookend. So we do the World Peace ceremony every month, just like we're about to do now after this talk, because Sangha members wanted a way to acknowledge and practice with all the tragedies and all the things that seem to keep happening. For a while there, it felt like every week there was something. There was a hurricane, there was a shooting, there was a something. How do you not be affected by that? And doesn't it feel natural to want to bring that into your practice? And as a community to acknowledge suffering, right? To look around and acknowledge suffering. So that wasn't going on until after I arrived, but we got that thing started. So as it happens, again in the Senmon Soto, we do a similar thing on the 15th of every month. The day after Ryakufusatsu is when that happens. So Ryakufusatsu is in the evening. The very next morning, there's a piece of our morning liturgy which is devoted to this sort of world peace ceremony. So this is why our particular world peace ceremony is always on the 3rd Sunday, because it has happened after Ryakufusatsu. So we're not doing it because it's a traditional ceremony, but as it happens, there was a sort of a traditional ceremony that met the needs that were rising in the Sangha, right? So there was a coming together, which was very meaningful about that. So it might be easy to understand what we mean by keeping forms simple. It's not doing things kind of any old which way, just to get through them because the fine points don't matter. Right? That would be a misunderstanding. It's not stripping our practice of all the traditional elements because somehow they're not relevant. That would be a misunderstanding. It's not jettisoning the elements we don't understand by deciding somehow, not necessary. That would also be a misunderstanding. None of those is what we mean by keeping our forms simple in order to understand what we're doing and why. So simple in this case means there is nothing extra. Now we get to think about what is extra, right? And I think this is why if you look at the practice vision under ritual, where we have a specialty, a Sanshin specialty for each of those, what I've put there is nothing extra. So you'll recall, there's under Zazen, our specialty is Sanshin. Under study, it's Dharma theme, Dogen themes. Under work, we have Nyoho and Bodhisattva leadership. For ritual, I'm thinking, could change, but I'm thinking right now, the specialty there is nothing extra. What makes our What creates our particular approach to ritual here? And it feels like nothing extra. So that means no extra ideas, no fabrications, no attachments, aversions, assumptions. That doesn't mean complexity is extra. That doesn't mean traditional elements are extra. That doesn't mean doing something which is relatively complicated is extra. That's not what extra is. Extra is, what are we attached to? What are our ideas about that? It's the same attitude we take to the rest of our practice, of course, right? When we sit zazen, nothing extra. When we work together as a community, nothing extra. When we study the Dharma, nothing extra. When we wear Buddha's robes, we ring the bells, we offer the incense on the bows, and we chant the sutras, nothing extra. You know, chanting is chanting. Zazen is doing zazen. So when we look at what Uchiyama Roshi was doing with his own practice vision that included not a lot of ritual, it would be easy to sort of bend that to match our own preferences, right? I sometimes get the sense that folks that don't practice here regularly have read all the books, and they find this style meaningful because it doesn't include the things they don't like. That's not true for everybody, but every once in a while I get this feeling like, I really like what you're doing because it doesn't do all that extra, ceremonial stuff. Well, not an understanding of what we're doing here. So if you practice on your own, without a teacher, without a sangha, it is admittedly harder to engage in all the forms, all the ceremonies. You know, you don't have the artifacts. You don't maybe have the space. And maybe you don't have the experience of doing that with a group, right? Or maybe your previous church or spiritual community did rituals that didn't make sense to you, didn't feel meaningful to you, felt disconnected somehow from you. You don't want to be back in that same position with Zen practice. You know, maybe that was part of what attracted you to Zen practice was those things didn't exist. Maybe you're simply looking for a spiritual technology and you want to use Zazen in that way, and if so, then ritual feels kind of unnecessary. I'm only in it for the Zazen, and the rest of that stuff, not important. So more than once, someone has said to me, well, you know, I'm really just interested in Buddhism as a philosophy. In other words, I don't care about all the rest of the elements of that thing. I just, I want to sort of take on Buddhism as a philosophy. Well, we know it's not a philosophy. It's not a lifestyle. It's a practice. It's something we do. It's not something we sort of think about and debate about with our friends over coffee. It would be easy to do that, but that is a way for it not to challenge us in body and mind, I think, because it's only about our idea. So it'd be easy to sort of conveniently argue that since our practice is all about giving up attachment, not clinging, right, not grasping, we should also give up our attachment to tradition or our attachment to ritual or anything that might make us feel uncomfortable, right? So you could also conveniently argue that everything we do expresses the Dharma. So particular rituals, particular ceremonies, liturgies, forms, not necessary. So in my world, that's called spiritual bypassing. Right? It's about falling down on the side of emptiness and ignoring the side of form. So rather than holding both of these things equally. And the whole ritual section of our practice vision allows us to hold those things equally. So Uchiyama Roshi isn't doing any of that stuff, right? He thought ritual was important. Todo-san has also thought ritual was important. So important, in fact, that if we can't be bothered to understand what we're doing and why, it's probably better that we don't do it, right? It's not that these things aren't important, it's that our understanding of them is important. If we don't know what we're doing, why are we doing it? That's an opportunity for us to take a step back. So Uchiyama Roshi's concern was that ritual and form can become empty gestures. We can find ourselves just going through the motions. We just are doing something because we're told to do it. Because that's what's happening today, that's what's on the calendar today. There's some expectation we're going to maintain a certain level of ritual. Maybe because the teacher says so, right? Or because some other temple, some other Dharma community is doing something, so we think we should do that too, whether or not we really know what it's about, or we really know what it's for, or what it means. So when I arrived, I have to tell a story about myself. When I arrived, I suggested, we're doing the Heart Sutra in Japanese 3 times a week. I said, Todo-san, how about if we do the echo in Japanese too? Because I was fresh from the Senmon Soto. I knew how to do that stuff. Let's do the echo in Japanese as well, or at least once in a while. And he laughed at me. And he said, I would be the only one that understood it. Well, yeah. It's like, had I thought that through, clearly I did not yet understand the Sanshin style of practice, right? My thought was, I know how to do this, so we should be doing everything we know how to do. Well, I mean, even I don't understand what I'm chanting if I'm, chanting those echoes in Japanese. So, he had to sort of pull me back. So would it have been possible to do that entire service in Japanese? Sure. Was there a good reason to do it at Sanshin? Not really. We have a Sangha of not Japanese people and people who don't speak the language. So why would we do that, right? He had to make me take a step back and think about why would we do that? So, it simply would have been a reproduction of what we do in the Senmon Soto. It would have had almost no meaning for this group, would have been extra, right? That was not a case of nothing extra. So looking back, of course, this is exactly what Uchiyama Roshi was trying to avoid. Why would I chant echoes in Japanese for nobody understood them? It simply becomes an empty gesture. So another way that ritual can become meaningless is when we're so familiar with what we're doing, we've been doing it every day for years and years, we sort of start going through the motions. So we do the same zazen, we do the same kinhin, we do the same service 5 days a week, every morning, every weekday morning. We could really stop engaging fully with what we're doing because we don't have to think about it. Our bodies know what to do. We open our mouths, chanting comes out. We're probably not reading it anymore. It would be easy to sort of disengage from that. Well, my body is here, it's doing something. You don't have to think about it anymore. And that makes me think, what about Sanshin, where we're very intentionally doing the same thing over and over and over and over for 17 hours a day for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, right? And we're doing that. I mean, there's a purpose for that. We really want to sort of disengage the intellectual thinking about that. It needs to just be, this is what we're doing. It would be easy to stop paying attention to that and simply become robotic, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do in Sanshin, right? When we're really trying to focus on, what am I doing? So this is one of the reasons I encourage people during Sanshin to be as silent as they can be. So silence during Sanshin is not simply about we don't talk to each other, because there is no talking during Sanshin, right? I've sort of come to understand silence is more than that. We have to pay attention to everything we're doing or else we're going to make noise. And that means, how do you fluff your zafu? That means, how do you pick up the bell mallet? How do you move a table? How do you handle your eating utensils? How do you open and close the door? How do you move in your robes and your clothes without making a lot of noise? I mean, everything. If you pay attention to every single thing you're doing with the idea that I'm not going to make noise, boy, you are there, right? And if we consider that Sanshin is one continuous period of zazen from the opening bell to the closing bell, then you think, well, I wouldn't be making that kind of noise in the middle of a zazen period. I wouldn't be stamping my feet or pushing something across the floor or slamming a door in the middle of a zazen period. So it really makes us, you are right there. It's a wonderful practice, really. So if we're making noise, our bodies are going through the motions, but we're not in our bodies. We're somewhere else. So silence is one aspect, I think, of keeping form simple. Can we do things silently? We could say keeping form simple is dropping off body and mind. There's a familiar phrase for us, right? Dropping our expectations, our ideas about ritual, who we are when we're doing it, what it means for my ego, am I doing it better than the person next to me, right? All that stuff, all those stories. So speaking of dropping off body and mind, let's take a minute to consider Dogen's approach to ritual. So Dogen's canon reflects the two things he was attempting to bring back from China to Japan. Anyone who's done the intro Dogen with me or heard this, you may have heard this from me before. One thing he brought back was the doctrines and teachings of the Chan school. He learned those from his teacher, Tendo Nyojo. Those are all of his writings about Buddhist teachings that feel more theoretical or more abstract. Shobogenzo, Eihei Kodoku, Hokyoki. They are actually all about practice, but they feel more abstract. The other thing he brought back from China was the institution of the Chan, what we might call monastery. I don't like the word, but right, the training temple, the monastery, which includes precepts as the training ground, the container for Zen practice. So he felt this was the way that practice was going to go forward. It needed that kind of container to keep practice alive and available. And this was how it was going to carry on into the future. That was how the dharma and the teachings were going to continue to be available. So that part of the canon includes concrete instructions on practice. These are things like Fukanza Zengi and Gakudo Yojinshu and the Eihei Shingi, and things we look at and go, oh, he's telling us exactly where to put things and how to do things. So all of Dogen's writings are about practice, but again, there's sort of two buckets, right? One is the more abstract Buddhist teachings. The other is the sort of practical instructions for how do we survive as a community? How do we practice together and get along together and function on a day-to-day basis as a community? So we may think at first those categories are unrelated. Well, he's doing this over here, he's doing this over here, because if you look at his writings, the tone can feel quite different, right, between those two buckets. We might think, well, the teachings are what we're really interested in, and the rest of that, description of how do we function in a training temple feels irrelevant for us in the modern West, because most of our Dharma centers don't look like the Senmon Soto, right? Most of us aren't doing all of those things. But we need to understand he was trying to make sure that practice was going to go on after he was gone. He's trying to put structure around this thing. Here we are again about ritual providing structure. He's trying to put structure around this so that there's some way for us to carry this forward. So, his feeling was the monastic container, or the sort of life in the temple with the forms and the rituals, was necessary if this practice was going to survive into another generation. So these teachings and the container are completely interpenetrated. We can't really do one without the other and fully understand what he was trying to do. So it might sound like a great idea to sort of slavishly reproduce Dogen's temple environment so we can fully enter into what he was trying to teach. And if we're going to do that, well, his practice is dead, right? We're trying to practice in a time and place other than here. So to simply make a model of what he was doing, to make a museum recreation of what he was doing, that practice is dead. It's not ours. It's not alive in this moment. So how do we take that container and those teachings and fully enter into them in a way that makes them fresh and alive and something that's happening in this moment? So one question is, how do we fully engage in what he's teaching, using the tools, the structures that he's given us? And how do we do that here and now and not sort of pretend to be back in somewhere between 1200 and 1253 medieval Japan? So how do we do that without picking and choosing and deciding what we're comfortable with and what doesn't challenge our egos, right? So a few years ago, Todo-san did an interview for a local web-based project here called Interior Mythos Journeys. You might remember that. Those materials are around on the website. One of the topics the interviewer asked him about was the role of ritual. So he said, well, it's important because it's an expression of our understanding of the basic reality of interconnectedness, right? So in other words, we're using body and mind to enact living together with other beings in harmony, right? Completely functioning together. So we have to put our hearts and minds into the form if it's going to mean something. Otherwise, it's just dead motions, right? Somehow our hearts and minds have to be in the middle of that. So he went on to say that community life is a miniature version of this network of interdependent origination. We have to pay attention to how we function with others, because if we don't pay attention to that, we risk causing some harm. We risk putting something into that network, into that community, which is not wholesome. So it's the same approach, I think, as being silent during sesshin. If we don't pay attention, we knock things together. If we don't pay attention, we make noise. If we don't pay attention, we step on somebody, we harm somebody. So here's one thing he said. It's important to express our gratitude and appreciation to others, and we need some expression using language or our bodies to carry out rituals such as making prostration or gasho. I think this gesture of gasho is the same as shaking hands in a Western culture. When we put these two palms together, we cannot hide anything. We cannot hide a weapon. This gesture shows, I have no intention to harm you. From this position, we cannot attack the person in front of us. Gasho is an expression of friendship, respect, and intimacy with someone, right? A very direct connection between interconnectedness, non-harming, and ritual or form, which is, that's an interesting intersection, right? When you come to Sanshin, I hope that's what you feel out of our forms. How do we function together as a community without hurting each other? And ritual is just one more aspect of that. So when you come to Sanshin, what kind of ritual do you see here? Some of these are going to be familiar. Some of them may be unfamiliar. If you're a newer practitioner, you might not have seen them all. Some of these things only happen once a year, or they happen on an as-needed kind of basis. So, basic forms that we do all the time, hand positions, gasho, shashu, ishu, right? Basic hand positions. Bows we frequently do. When we're entering the zendo, we're bowing to the cushion, we're bowing to the bell or the han before we strike it, right? Standing bows. We do full bows during services and ceremonies like we did this morning, full bows to the floor. There's a way that you do that. There's 5 points of contact between the body and the ground. We're careful about how we do those things. Knowing how to hold a sutra book, right, when we're chanting. Knowing how to offer incense when it's our turn to go up and offer incense after a ceremony. Knowing how to handle your raksu, your okesa. All of these things are building blocks for more complex rituals, more complex ceremonies, right? They're basic building blocks, and then we put those things together. So in the category of regular ceremonies, well, on a daily basis, we do the weekday morning service. So we do a couple of periods of zazen. We make full prostrations like we did this morning. We chant either the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo 3 times a week or the Heart Sutra 2 times a week and the Daihi Shindarani. And then we dedicate the merit of that chanting to Buddha and Dogen and Keizan as 3 important ancestors, and to the people we know who have died or may be ill. That's the personal, those are the cards you see on the altar there. So what does that mean? Well, things happen during liturgy in a particular order. That is not a random string of pearls, right? We do things during that liturgy in a certain order in order to have certain things happen. So we start out by bowing to Buddha. So we set aside our self-clinging. As soon as we're bowing to Buddha and raising his feet over our heads, we're putting self-clinging over here. Now we're ready to hear some dharma. Now when we're hearing sutras and chanting sutras, we're ready for that to come in, right? So we chant sutras, we let that teaching in. We also know we're not chanting for our own benefit, really, although it's helpful to us and beneficial to us to hear those teachings. That's not the point of that thing. We dedicate that merit to ancestors out of gratitude and to individuals who may be suffering. So that liturgy is not entirely about this person. On a monthly basis, we do Ryakufussatsu. We're going to do that again tomorrow night with Hoshin in charge. So we do full bows. We chant the verse of repentance, the 10 Buddha names, the Bodhisattva vows, the 3 refuges, right? So these are all really important foundational teachings, elements of our practice. We're chanting all those things to fully engage with them. And again, that happens in a certain order for a certain reason. The very first thing we do is repent. The very first thing we do is repentance. Put aside the self-clinging, right? Then we're ready to hear some other things. We're ready to invoke Buddhas. We're ready to take vows. We can't take vows until we do repentance. Those things have to go in that order, right? Then we take refuge. We hear the Dogen Zenji's essay on teaching and conferring the precepts. And from that, we renew our aspiration to follow those things. So we hear, again, the explanation of what are these precepts about, and we renew our aspiration to follow them. So what does that one mean? Well, it's the oldest Buddhist ceremony we still do. So I love to remember that when we're doing Ryakufussatsu. We are doing the oldest continuous thing that we still have. So I imagine Buddha Sangha getting together to do that when we do it, which is why when we do this, the lights are down, you know, we really try to focus on this thing. So Buddha Sangha used to gather at the full moon, used to confess any kind of wrongdoings, transgressions, and vow not to do those things anymore. So, as I say, from the very beginning, Todo-san has felt it was important for North Americans to have this sort of regular exposure, regularly hearing again, what are the precepts about, and regularly saying, yes, that's the way I want to live. Yes, I'm going to vow to live in that way and uphold those things. So also monthly is the World Peace Ceremony. So following our Dharma talk, again, full bows. Why? We're setting aside self-clinging. We chant the Heart Sutra. We get to hear some Dharma. And then we get to dedicate that to sort of turning and healing people who perpetuate suffering in the world, and also just upholding those who provide refuge, rescue from disaster, right? So it's not just... we're not only sort of recognizing the people that are doing something wholesome in the world, we're saying there are people doing something unwholesome in the world, and we also need to have compassion for them. So we do that ceremony because, as I say, folks in the Sangha wanted a way to acknowledge unfortunate things that were happening. When we do that in Japan, the morning after Ryakufussatsu, you kind of have to understand how that hatto looks. So there's a big altar, the space where we all stand and bow and chant, and then there's always a huge set of doors on this side. So when we do the world peace ceremony, we actually turn around and we open those doors. We make a makeshift altar and we open those doors and we send that chanting down the mountain. It's very much about sending that into the world. That is not the way we typically do liturgy. We typically do liturgy, facing Buddha. In the middle of the ceremony, we actually turn around and we send that out into the world, which is a really interesting practice, right? We don't have a way to do that here. But in your mind, please, when you're doing world peace ceremony, send that down the mountain. All right, on an annual basis, then, we do Nirvana Day, Buddha's birthday, Rohatsu, the 3 Buddha days. We do something following the talk, right? We do full bows, we chant the Heart Sutra, we offer incense. We recognize important events in Buddha's life, right? Those are the Sanbuki. So Buddha's life, Buddha's birth, awakening, and death, right? Without Shakyamuni, we wouldn't have this practice, right? So how can we not recognize what's going on with Shakyamuni, reflect on the nature of the Buddha treasure? That's a really important Dharma gate for us 3 times a year. So then in the summertime, we do the Honsoku Gyocha and the Hosen Shiki. So these are ceremonies ending the term of the Shuso, or the head novice. In mid-June, this is someone who for 3 months has taken on some additional leadership responsibility in the Sangha in order to learn how to be a teacher, right? So that person's given some talks, leading work practice, having some input into the way things happen here. So for those ceremonies, we have a formal tea. We hear a talk related to the koan that the Shuso will be answering questions about the next day. On the following day, then, the Shuso briefly takes over as a teacher. The point of that ceremony is the Shuso is now the abbot for that little space of time, right? And takes over answering questions. So this is why this person sits up here with a staff and says, give me your questions. This person is now the abbot or the teacher for the day. So all of that requires precise movements, carrying things, making bows, wearing the most formal kinds of robes. That is really a body and mind practice. You remember, right? I remember mine, which I did in Japan. It is, it's quite a thing to prepare for. So that is more formal than many of the things that we do here. So it's really useful balance, right? But there's real meaning behind that. There's real leadership development behind that. So the Shuso is demonstrating, he, she, they, know how to be a Dharma leader in a very public way. So you're doing that in front of the Sangha. The Sangha is supporting you in that, but you're doing that in order to demonstrate, yes, I have some Dharma mastery. I know how to carry out forms. I know how to answer Dharma questions. I can handle my zagu and my robes, and I can move in a dignified way. I have, Buddha's dignified deportment. So it's one of the requirements for becoming authorized clergy. We are one of the places that is authorized to do that in a way which Sodashu will recognize. So that's an important part of our liturgical year. And then, of course, we do Zaike Tokudo, or Jukaie, receiving lay precepts. That's the last day of the July precepts retreat. So the Kaite, the people receiving the precepts, vow to uphold those 16 precepts. They receive a Raksu, and a lineage paper, and a Dharma name, and many folks here have done that, right? So when we're doing that, the community is present, the Sangha is present to witness that commitment and to support that commitment to the Dharma and to sort of welcome these folks into Buddha's family. So whether or not you're wearing a Raksu yourself, if you're in the audience, you're sort of welcoming these people into, right, Buddha's life, world of Buddha. I think it also every year serves as a recommitment for people who are already wearing robes of some kind, right? It's like if you're married and you go to a wedding, you sort of recommit in your mind. I think the precepts ceremony is a little bit like that. If you've already done precepts, you sort of recommit. So occasionally then, of course, we do a Shukkei Tokudo, or a novice ordination, right? After some period of discernment and preparation, someone's decided, yes, I want to put myself on the path to being a Dharma teacher, to ordain as clergy. So we do a ceremony which looks a lot like the Jukaie in some ways. That is the first step in embarking on the training and the study that we need in order to carry on this lineage in a recognized, authorized way. Some way that the denomination will recognize. So it looks a lot like Jukaie. In addition to just receiving the robes, this person is taking precepts again, and a lineage paper and a Dharma name. So that ceremony has to happen in certain ways in order to meet the requirements of the denomination. Again, we're one of the places that can do that. So community is there to witness and support somebody taking on that additional layer of responsibility, making that additional commitment to becoming a Dharma leader. So Dharma transmission happens if and when. I'm not going to tell you anything about that because that's a secret set of ceremonies that happens between the teacher and the person being transmitted. So I'm not going to go into detail about that thing. It takes a week. It's a series of private ceremonies that happen between the teacher and the novice. That also has to be done in a particular way to meet denominational requirements, and yes, we do that. So those pieces we don't have control over. They're regulations we have to meet, but not difficult. So after Dharma transmission, then that recipient can be functioning independently as clergy. That's the teacher saying, I now believe that you have the chops to go out and teach on your own. Traditionally, it means the teacher has recognized the student as having sort of the same level of awakening. So we can have a long conversation about what actually gets transmitted. That's a conversation for another day, right? Okay. What ties all of those ritual ceremonies, forms together? Again, the active engagement with the community across space and time. So if you're looking at something like Dharma transmission, what has been transmitted from Shakyamuni all the way down through time and space to here? If we're chanting the Heart Sutra or the Hanya Shingyo, how many practitioners all over the world for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years have chanted exactly that same text? When we're doing Ryakusatsu, my goodness, we're in the same room with Buddha. Right? So this engagement across space and time is a really, I think, an interesting aspect of this thing. We're embodying the same awakening, right? We're doing the same practice. So we may be separated from Buddha by 2,500 years and thousands of miles, but somehow we're in the same space with him and his Sangha, and we're doing the same practice. You may know I started my practice in Minnesota. I was at Minnesota Zen Center, which when I arrived had been there about 30 years. And I remember sort of being in that zendo and imagining all the people who had practiced in that zendo for 30 years, right? All that zendo had seen in 30 years. I really felt like I was kind of in the middle of something, space and time, which was really interesting. Okay, so when we receive precepts, we're joining that continuous line of practitioners that have carried this practice, carried these teachings, kept them alive across space and time. So whether you're receiving those precepts as a lay person or as an ordained person, you are keeping Buddha's practice alive. You are practicing with Buddha, carrying certain forms, certain ceremonies across space and time, I think. So we're not doing any of this alone, right? It takes a community to make this work. Ritual is, yes, we have individual things we're doing with individual bodies and minds. Yes, we may be practicing at home and carrying out some of these things, but in the largest possible sense, it takes a community to make that stuff work. Ritual, I think, keeps that alive for us. So I don't have my clock, but I'm going to stop there. What time is it? 10:56. That's a good stopping place. What would you all like to say about form, ceremony, ritual, body and mind as it relates to all of that? I'll start with people here, but then if people at home would like to jump in, of course, there's a space for that. Please.
So you're making reference to the World Peace Ceremony.
Yes.
I didn't know anything about the Japanese precursor. And so that was nice to hear. And your notion of sending it down the mountain. Mm-hmm. I want to point out that we do shift from this altar to this altar.
We do.
And the world tragedies is like a burning house. Mm-hmm. And that's a fire escape.
That's true. That's true. There's a hole in that wall. We know because the cold draft comes through there. So we know.
So we have a symbolic equivalency here.
We do. You didn't know when you cut a hole in the masonry that that's what you were doing, right? I love it. I'm going to remember that now. So we are really sending our dharma, sending our good wishes sort of out into the world. I just always thought that was a really meaningful part of that, doing that in Japan. Of course, the real challenge was you do that in January.
Oh.
I mean, we didn't have heat in there anyway. All we had was kerosene heaters that were like rocket engines. But yeah, it was cold. When we were in the Hato in the morning in January, we would always check the temperature. It's just like you want to know how you're suffering and you want to know how badly you're suffering. So you look at the, it's like your fingers are, no, you can't hold incense. The wind would come whistling under the floor. If you were the doan, somehow there were a series of like gaps on the boards and knots in the boards, and the wind would come whistling under the temple and up through there, and you were the one with the metal implements in January. That was a lot of fun. Anyway, not relevant for your point. Thank you for that. That's interesting. So we really are sending our good wishes out down the mountain. Other things folks would like to say about ritual, form, ceremony, please.
Well, it seems that the emphasis, of course, is on like knowing, excuse me, knowing what we're doing and why, keeping things simple. A lot of religious traditions, rituals intentionally meant to not be understood, intentionally meant to be kind of arcane in some way.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if and for what reason there would be space for that here, or maybe there isn't space for that.
I think the one place that shows up a little bit is dharma transmission, because there's a little bit of, that's not a public thing. Certainly, so I'm going to say, I think in North American Soto Zen, we are more inclined to want to know what we're doing and why. One thing that happens to Westerners when we go to Japan is we're told to do things or we're shown how to do things, and the first thing we ask is, why are we doing that? And that is not the way you learn in a Senmon Soto. They say, that's not important, just do it. Learn it with your body, and you will get it, right? So there isn't a checklist and an explanation. And I think in North America, we tend to want to know, like, why are we doing this? What does it mean? But certainly, if we look at the history of Soto Zen, there is so much syncretism with Shingon and Vajrayana practices and other things. In a way, we sort of can't separate out elements of that. I used to think I could go through and just like figure out where everything came from, and I realized it's just kind of not possible, right? So, you know, in a way, nothing is hidden. It's all right in front of us. There's the Dharma. Even if we don't understand right away what the ceremony is that we're doing, it's a complete expression of awakening, and in that way, you know, we get it. But I think certainly here, and probably in North America, there's a not so much emphasis on things which are esoteric, and yet we can't say those are separated from our tradition, right? So for our purposes, my understanding of why we practice in this way, where we say we need to know what we're doing and why, is so that we are not clinging to ideas or stories about what we're doing, right? So we need to know what we're doing and why, so that we're not doing something for unwholesome reasons. It's because I want to be fancy, or because I want to pretend to be Japanese, or because I think we should be impressing people or something like that, right? So I think there's more than one way to look at that, yeah? Other things in the room, please.
I just want to add to what you just said. With the Thursday evening group.
And you probably have to give people context about that.
I do. Thursday evening group is a recovery group. People with addictions or trying to stay away from addictions of all sorts. And so we do it within a Buddhist context, and it dovetails beautifully with that kind of thing. So it becomes, I think what people grab a hold of is that there's this sort of practice there. They don't necessarily know what they're doing.
Sure.
So it's extremely minimal. And the best way that I could explain it was it becomes a pivot point. This place where you can break the habits of mind, the things that create addiction that you hold on to. And it seems to connect that way.
Well, I mean, I can imagine there's a whole piece in there about habituated thinking, right? I mean, I'm guessing if you're dealing with addictive behaviors, there's some habituated thinking there. So how do you break those habits of body and mind? And then when you hold that up next to ritual, in which we're saying we're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, that's an interesting intersection. It's like you maybe want to trade some unwholesome habits for some more wholesome habits. Yeah.
Well, and then there are the personal stories. All of the literature out there has the personal stories. So there are people that have been priests with addiction problems, and they are able to explain a little better or to talk about what happens within that context. So, and how this, I mean, it just all of a sudden lights or awareness goes on.
And I also think, so what I've heard, one of the things I've heard from folks who do prison chaplains, prison work, in the prisons, the inmate sanghas often like to chant the Metta Sutta, which is sending out well-being to others. And it feels like a little bit of a way to take back control. It's like I've done some things that, were unwholesome and I'm not so proud of those things, but I'm still able, I still have the ability to generate goodwill and to hand that off to somebody. And to give form for that, to give structure for that, feels like there is something I can contribute as a human being. Yeah, okay, I'm incarcerated, I've done something. But still, I have the power to do good in the world. And we might not know how to do that without some kind of structure that says, at least we're going to get together and chant this sutra that says, my intention is to do good in the world, right? So I wonder if structure is, adding some structure, some ritual structure is not also maybe helpful for your group in that way.
Just the fact that the people that are regulars there, this is their Thursday night's thing. And without fail, everyone says, this is the best night of my week. And I think it gives them an opportunity to actually understand you're dropping away self.
Yeah.
Which oftentimes, that's part of the problem with addiction. You're just holding on to something.
Of course. And you're doing it, if you're doing ritual, you're doing it with body and mind.
Right.
It's not just, oh, here's my idea that I'm going to change my life. It's like there's something about doing that with the body, which is really interesting. So,
right.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Other things in this room? Please. You're handing to somebody else, okay?
I was just gonna say it's kind of just dawning on me in a helpful way, to see why ritual is separated from work practice. To see them as their own domains in a certain way, because it's kind of like when we come here for a work day on a Sunday, there's a certain amount of ritual we do around that work day, but otherwise it's just kind of wide open. We're doing many various activities. Somebody's weeding, and somebody's mowing the lawn, and somebody's working on the valence, and somebody's rewiring the fans, and there's all this kind of disparate activity that doesn't have basically the structure that ritual gives. So although both of these things are very much body and mind practices, it's like with ritual it gets kind of refined in a certain, or defined in a certain way that is basically is one dharma gate, and then with a more sort of freewheeling work practice, there's less. You have to kind of have to do more work to make it into a practice. You got to realize it yourself in a certain way. That ritual kind of gives a little support. So
I think so, because really, in the world of, if you bowed twice instead of 3 times, would lightning strike you? No, right? We've agreed we're going to be in a, we're going to do things in a certain way, and that number 3 has a certain significance and all of that. So I think what you're saying is important, because I know in my own heart and mind, I'm still trying to understand what that difference is. I can say some things about it, but I don't entirely get it here yet, right? Because as a Sangha, we've not spent that much time, I think, really digging into what does ritual mean for us. So it's a real, I think it's a real opportunity. So I think that's one of the important things, right? The structure turns out to be a really useful handrail, but we can't cling to the structure either, right? So to compare that with a workday is interesting. It's like form and emptiness in a certain kind of way, right? It's all expression of Buddha nature. It's all expression of awakening. And yet when we do things in a certain way, it holds us up in a particular way, which is helpful. So I hope we, continue to have the conversation about this, because I don't think this is at all entirely clear for us. yet, right? I think we need to chew on it for a while. Did you have something too?
Yeah, I'm gonna ramble.
Oh,
Uh-oh.
go get a cup of coffee and Yogan's gonna ramble.
My apologies. And don't forget a nice muffin too. One of the things I'm finding out about my practice and probably my life is it's a question for understanding being.
Mhm.
Not just the concept, but living.
Mm-hmm.
And a long time ago, sometime during the pandemic or maybe just before it, I realized that as we bowed to Buddha, Buddha exists. And Buddha would not exist if we did not bow. And when you do that, it's not a one-way relationship.
Right.
It's two-way.
Yep.
And so when you brought up, a while ago, you brought up ritual. And oh, and where it came, what it was, or you just brought up the topic of ritual. You didn't say anything, just trying to figure it out. And I sat there and I thought for a minute, and it just came to me that ritual is nothing other than the transmission of Buddha to us.
Mm-hmm.
It's the container in which he created, or he created and other people created as well,
Mm-hmm.
that make us who we are. Just as much as Mayokesa is not me,
Mm-hmm.
but it is me.
Mhm.
It's, I put in stitches to this, but other people put in stitches. I can tell because they look good, these look bad. But you gotta do some identification there. But I mean, we even have this in our, within our echo. So when we, after the first echo for the Makahani Miya Shinyo or Heart Sutra, we reverently offer the merit of our chanting to the founding teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, our first ancestor in Japan, great teacher Eie Dogen, the eminent ancestor, great teacher Keizan Jokin, and then the successive ancestors who transmitted the light of Dharma into the eternal three treasures in the 10 directions. Mm-hmm. We have all of them, and when we practice, bow, chant, when we do our rituals, we're doing it with them.
Yep. Absolutely. So I think people sometimes wonder how and why we invoke Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the beginning of rituals, and it's not like they're not already there. But it's some recognition for us that we are doing this with all beings across space and time. This is engagement with the community across space and time. So there's an example of a part of the community, right, across space and time. So it's not only those three particularly important ancestors, it's everybody who has transmitted this practice, which, yes, there's a lineage that we can point to and say there are 83 generations, but it's just everybody who's ever practiced, right? Mm-hmm. And it's all beings and non-sentient beings that are preaching the Dharma, and in that way it's a very big Sangha. Yeah.
Well, and then it also begs the question, the very next paragraph after that is, we also offer it to the guardian deities of the temple and to all Dharma protecting devas and good spirits. Oh dear, what are those?
Yes, and people aren't always comfortable with that. So this is how we get to sort of dig in and have a conversation about that. What's your definition of a protective deity? Well, it could be the tree in the yard. I mean, it doesn't have to be sort of a celestial being that we anthropomorphize into something. It could simply be the recognition that we're supported by all beings. So
and one of the things that bugged me before I did Tokudo was that I knew I initially was ordaining under Suiko Redding Roshi, and you would always instill in me that I would be carrying her, mm-hmm. And carrying her Dharma, mm-hmm. And I'm like, but I don't remember a single word she said.
And it's all in your body, right?
I don't know if it's all in my body or whatnot, but it really came out in Last Sesshin, in Rahatsu. So I realized, oh, she did transmit something.
Yes,
it is there.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's
So when you're bowing to Buddha,
When I'm bowing, yeah, so
you're
when
also
I'm,
bowing to her.
yes.
Yourself.
Yes.
It's not something that, I mean, it's not something that we pick up mentally.
Right.
It's something that we start to, it's something that we gradually inculcate and
Yes.
carry.
Yes.
And so just the very nature of our walk, in Shashu, it's not just us.
Right. That's right. And I think if we don't put some intention, if we don't have some intention around deportment and form, right, we miss those teachings. Because I'm someone who lives in my head, man. I don't have any idea what my body's doing most of the time. Anyone who knows me and sees me drop things and trip and whatnot, I'm not terribly body aware. So ritual is really good for me as a dharma gate like that, because it reminds me of something. There's something else happening here, which is bigger than this body and mind. So I hope, as I say, that we get to continue as a community to have conversations like this, because we've just not had the chance to do it yet. And I can just see all this interesting stuff coming out of everybody, which, yay! That's what I want to see happening. So, other things in this room?
Just one
Please,
quick
Carl.
thing. I think we're all saying the same thing, but to
That's
me,
all right.
the ritual of bowing
Mhm.
is an expression of gratitude,
That's one thing it's an expression of, yes.
right? And,
Yes.
and I think in the same thing that what you're saying, it's the gratitude of all those who are with us and came before us
Mhm.
that we wouldn't be here without,
Yeah, absolutely. Because how would we be doing this practice?
right?
Right? So yes, the actual sort of official lineage, but then just all the people who've practiced here even before us. 20 years ago, there were people in Zendo. If they weren't here, we wouldn't be here. So it's only natural, I think, for gratitude to arise to all of those beings and all of those practitioners. We might not have met them. We might not like them all personally, and yet we wouldn't be here. Right? Organizational karma is a really interesting thing. That's a topic for another day. Other things here? Sawyer, is there anybody at home? Something to say?
Yes, we have a hand raised from Abby.
Okay, Abby.
Yes. I'm wondering if you could comment on why we include the Daishin Dharani in our service, which I very much enjoy chanting, but I know it's untranslatable.
Yep. So, yeah, I can say just a short thing about that, and then I'll point everybody toward a couple of earlier talks that Doju did about the Daihishin. Are they not on the website? Are they not on the? They're lost?
We need his notes.
Yeah! Okay, so I can't point you to that.
Lost, yeah.
Okay, so there's actually lots of information out there about the Daihishin, but briefly, we tend to do that as a sort of a protective spell. So a Dharani is a spell, right? So there's something that's supposed to be magical about that particular language. It's Sino-Sanskrit. It's not, we think it's Japanese, it's Sino-Sanskrit. So when we're chanting that thing together, we're generating a certain kind of protective merit, which then we send out to the people who have died or the people who are ill. And that's the typical place that sutra shows up in liturgy. We do it sometimes at grave sites when we're interring ashes, or when we're sending the body in the crematorium, we're sending the body into the flames. It tends to be used in that way. So it's not so much about a text that we read to sort of extract teachings from. It's the act of chanting it which creates a certain kind of merit or a certain kind of protection that we're sending out to those beings that need it. That's the Reader's Digest version, right? People have tried to translate it. I mean, it's possible. It's kind of gibberish. Really, it doesn't have a lot of meaning in the way that if we read the Heart Sutra, we kind of know what that means. So that kind of Dharani is more about the act of chanting it. That's not the only Dharani we do, and they all tend to be protective, right? There's one in the training temple that we do in the morning, which is about protecting the temple, protecting the kitchen, right? There's lots of Dharanis out there. So I have to say, from time to time, if I feel like I'm in some kind of imminent danger, I might quickly do a Dharani just to protect myself and the people around me. Is that enough for right now, Abby?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Other things from folks at home?
Sino-Sanskrit?
Sino-Sanskrit.
What is that?
sort of the Chinese interpretation of the Sanskrit, which has been transliterated such that we can.
Oh, okay, so it's just transliterated,
Yeah.
I got you, all right.
Yep. I mean, you can get into the technical part of that as well, but other folks at home, do you see anybody, Sawyer?
No.
We good for now? All right. So in that case, then let's move on to the ritual of the day, which is the World Peace Ceremony. So let's do our closing chant. We'll take a few minutes to reset. And thank you, everybody, very much.